This is Michael Reid Trice with the Religica Theolab at the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. Today I'm in conversation with Jim Winkler, who is the General Secretary and President of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States. We're talking about religion in the post-election, the religious pulse, and a response to racism. Take a listen. Here we are just a couple of weeks now after the election of the President of the United States. We now have a president-elect. And I'm sure you've been in conversation with a number of religious interlocutors, friends, and colleagues about what should be our collective response to this election as we think about the road ahead. What do you think and what are you saying?
Well, there has been lots of angst during this election campaign, of course, and it really isn't over with yet because the transition is frankly, so rocky right now. I mean, there's little cooperation going on. Interestingly, some of the tables that I sit around, such as the faith table that's convened by Jim Wallace, or the Circle of Protection, which includes the NCC, the National Association of Evangelicals, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, and a variety of other groups, we actually have evangelicals, Catholics, mainline Protestants, and others together around those tables. So the funny thing is we're actually able to talk about public policy initiatives, meeting human needs, working for peace, in spite of perhaps some theological differences. And yet it seems on Capitol Hill and in many other places around the country, the divide is so intense that people aren't even talking to one another. I mean, after all, Pelosi doesn't speak with Trump or with McConnell, and they don't speak to her. I've heard many stories over the years of how the days when people could stand up and vocally disagree with one another and go out and have a drink or dinner together or have their families over with one another, that Capitol Hill culture, that's all gone. So part of what I think that we are facing here is a way to just talk with each other.
Well, that's part of the issue. And as you're describing it on Capitol Hill, but also we see this in local neighborhoods. There's something about the sinews of our capacity to trust one another that have been, we might say, dissolved. There's a lot of grief and weariness in the system right now. Yes, due to a pandemic, into a viral pandemic, but generally in terms of the very things you're mentioning. How do we reconstruct conversation and how do we address our own weariness?
That's a really good question. I know for me, things like daily prayer and Bible study reading are crucial, but also commentary. I love reading Bergman's reflections on scripture passages. It always challenges me, makes me think outside the box or in fresh new ways. Even though many of the member churches of the National Council of Churches are shrinking numerically, these are some of the places in this country where you have Republicans and Democrats still together, worshiping God, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless. Right now, some of this is a little bit out of the box ordinary because of the COVID pandemic. But there are many churches where you have just Republicans or just Democrats in the pews. But in a lot of our churches, you still have a pretty broad range of people. And finding ways to have that conversation can happen. I know for many years, I led a Sunday school class, an adult Sunday school class in my local church, where we talked about social issues. But what we also did was take covered dishes to one another's house if somebody was sick, have picnics together, go to see a play together. I mean, those are the things that, in a sense, enabled us to talk about tough issues. This can still be done. I know that it's a hard and rocky time. We haven't gotten it off the ground yet, but we at the National Council of Churches have been talking with the Conference of National Black Churches about fostering conversations between white churches and black churches around race. I don't think that's going to be that hard to do. I do think that the conversations will likely be in many places challenging, but I think church people are one of the key places still in this country where we can intentionally talk to one another and help knit back the social fabric.
Well, I think one of the things that you're referring to is the kind of religious impulse, or maybe even in the country that there's a religious pulse. There's something that we should be doing together. And some are talking about this in terms of a phrase called the Great Reset, whether it's in how we think of our economy, how we think about human society, how we think about our fundamental rights in terms of freedom of expression that's different from hate speech, but that we need somehow a deeper sense of, or a reservoir for how we're going to imagine our shared future. Is any of that language familiar to you? And even if not, what do you see as the pulse of all of this that we need to be attentive to now?
You can help set the conditions that will improve the situation. For example, in the Great Depression, in the midst of all of that suffering, Franklin Roosevelt and those around him said, okay, people need to have some basic security. They need to have income. We need to have a retirement program. We need to have some creative programs such as for arts and history, things like that. And collectively, this almost sounds old-fashioned these days, but collectively, we are the government. We've had for decades a point of view that the government is the enemy. Ronald Reagan articulated that a lot, and a lot of people bought into that. But that point of view existed long before Reagan, of course. However, articulating that idea that we're all in it together is crucial. And I think fundamentally a lot of people do believe that. There's that other more Hobbesian worldview, which is, well, you can say that, Jim, but that's pie in the sky stuff. Really, you're in it for yourself, and if you're lucky, you can depend on your family and a small circle of friends. But life is nasty, brutish, and short. You better get what you can while you can. The Christian worldview is fundamentally opposite to that, and that's what we have to proclaim. And it's not just the Christian worldview, the Islamic and the Jewish and Hindu and Buddhist worldview. When we have these interreligious dialogues through the National Council of Churches, and we find a lot more commonality than we do differences. But we also find professionals who have not been part of these formal dialogues before. So we shouldn't assume that whether it's at the local level or the national level, that people who are involved have had this kind of experience participating in conversations and strategizing together on how to build a just society. And the more people that we can involve in it, the better.
I want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly, too, in a different lens. If I'm one of those individuals who sees myself really much further on the right perspective, or the right-wing perspective, in an approach to faith and an approach to how I understand the role of government, some of the things you've said, I might say, well, gosh, that's just, when Jim's making an appeal to socialism, or it may ring alarm bells. What do you say to an individual who may see what you just said through a filter, even as you're appealing directly to the kind of core gospel values that, in my tradition, I may say, well, actually, I appeal to those too. Like, how do you cross that bridge?
There's no easy method, in my opinion. Perhaps people are right that right now it's tougher than ever. I still think that ultimately most people want to work for a better society, a more just society. They have different thoughts of how to get there. There's no question about it. And some people want to quickly use labels, no doubt about it. For years, I led seminars on national and international affairs for United Methodists, young people and adults. And what I found was that when they had the opportunity to sit in a room, listen to speakers, have conversation, have prayer, Bible study, that a lot of times what people would say was, I just didn't realize. I just didn't know. It's like a light has gone on for me. And what I would repeatedly say was, okay, that's cool, that's understandable, but now you know. Now you never, ever for the rest of your life have an excuse to say, I just didn't know. And so now the question is, are you going to work to change the society for the better, to battle injustice and racism, or are you just going to sit on the sideline? Most of these seminar participants were young people, but you could see folks saying, no, I want to be part of the effort to build a better and more just society. So I'd rather concentrate as much as I can on that than trying to persuade another 62-year-old white guy like me who fundamentally disagrees to change their mind. There comes a time in your life where your views are pretty well set, and my experience has been at my station in life, a lot of the people around me, they pretty much know what they think, and that's that.
To this point, for the 62-year-old white man or woman or person out there who's listening to this, there's something also hopeful in what you described in terms of the work with historic Black churches, the work around racism or race or structural racism in this country. However we describe it, we've got some serious challenges as a society about how we're going to heal the divisions around race. Here we are with a new election. We have a new administration coming in, recognizing that isn't the end all. I mean, we all have to do our own work in particular, and no single administration is going to be able to undo the fabric of all of this. What is the work that you see ahead? What hope do you have around the conversations you're participating in for resolving or addressing some of these historic ruptures around race?
After I took office in early 2014, it was just a few months later that Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And within a couple of months, I had taken the National Council of Churches governing board out there to Ferguson. A few months after that was the massacre of the 9-Git Church in Mother Emanuel in Charleston. I went down to the funeral for Reverend Pinckney, and a few months later, I took the National Council of Churches down to Charleston. And Black church leaders in the conversations around the governing board made these kinds of points. We're committed to the ecumenical movement and Christian unity. We've been part of the National Council of Churches and its predecessor, the Federal Council of Churches, from the outset, over more than 100 years. We value the relationships here. We value the witness of the National Council of Churches. But we turn to one another out in the hallway or as we're walking back to the hotels from these meetings and worship services at Mother Emanuel and so forth, and we say, why do we still come to these meetings? I'm weary. I'm tired of white churches talking the talk but not walking the walk. And we decided that we were going to have our primary focus of a council of churches to fight racism. And I made the comment, it sounds like it was made in jest, but it was not. But I said, why have a council of churches if you're not going to deal with the toughest issues? We can talk about our differences on whether or not to have bishops or whether or not to baptize by sprinkling of water or immersion or whatever. And those conversations should take place. But a lot of the conversation is, what about, my son or my daughter being afraid of being pulled over by the police? And so that's our focus now, is fighting racism, eradicating racism. It's really hard, but we've set ourselves in this direction. And unfortunately, everything, it seems, that has unfolded in this country over the last few years confirms that we were right to do so. And it's as if we have reached the crux of the matter in this nation. We're finally saying we have to address white supremacy. We have to address the legacy of racism. We have to deal with reparations. And so we're partnering with the Conference of National Black Churches and with a variety of others to try to make change. And so now, I think with this new administration coming in, we have an opening. I mean, let's be honest, the last 4 years has been nothing but resistance. It's as if the white community, and this is being very simplistic, but much of the white community is fighting a rear guard action against the change and the drive toward racial justice that's been part of the trajectory of this nation for literally decades. And when I say a rear guard action, because I think this is God's justice. We're getting on the right side of God, the correct side of God, when we're working for racial justice. But also, if you want to be very, very practical about it, let's look at the demographics in this country. It's becoming a multicultural country. It's not going to be a white-dominated nation. And we all have to learn how to live together and to do things right. This is the moment. We've got to do it. And I'm glad that we're part of this wave, this movement for racial justice.
You've been listening to the Religica Theolab podcast in the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. To learn more about the center's work and for resources to be used in local communities, visit us at seattleu.edu/thecenter.